And over the years, we intend to do individual classes on individual books. So just to keep in mind, this is really a flyover. So, hopefully it gives you a big picture, and then later, at different points, you can zoom in on some details. I think the first primary thing we're going to cover tonight is the Exodus itself. And the Exodus is really central to the Old Testament. I've said that Abraham is the most important, maybe, figure in the Old Testament. I might say, though, that the Exodus is maybe the most important event in the Old Testament. It's probably referred to more than any other event in the rest of the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So, for example, think of all the Psalms and how they tell or relate the Exodus again and again and again. They go back to that repeatedly. And for Jews, this is the beginning, right? The Jewish calendar, I don't know what year it's in, but it starts there, right? So the Christian calendar starts roughly with the birth of Jesus. We're a few years off. But the Jewish calendar starts with the Exodus. And every Jew is supposed to, this is continued.
I didn't do it.
Yeah. It's in a locked closet.
Really counting.
It's Halloween. But every Jew is commanded to consider that he himself escaped from Egypt, escaped from slavery in Egypt. Every year at Passover, they're supposed to think that way. So it really is the pivotal moment of the Old Testament, and it's one of the moments most related to what Jesus did in his life, death, and resurrection. It deals with the Mosaic covenant. We've dealt with a lot of covenants. But it deals with the Mosaic covenant. And really, this is what, in the New Testament, when it says the Old Covenant, it's referring to the Mosaic covenant. And Exodus, but including Leviticus, Numbers, are the typological toolbox for the New Testament. If you remember when I referred to the types, there are endless types of Christ in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. There's endless events and people, images that point forward to what Christ did and prefigure Jesus. Not going to spend a lot of time on dating. I'll just use what most people think is a pretty conservative date, 1446, BC. I think I've said this before. I can't write. Dating is some of the most boring stuff to me. I don't think it's as important for us. And you can understand probably why the Egyptians didn't record this event. Their slave population rose up, routed them and got out of the country. It's not an event that people recorded back then. By the way, it's worth mentioning, when you read history writing from other countries back then, nobody records the bad stuff. Does that make sense? Like if somebody, if a king has a history of his reign recorded, you don't record the bad stuff. That's why Israel's literature is so interesting, because you get the bad stuff, right? You get the bad kings, you get a lot of, Moses doesn't always come across great. It's totally unique in the ancient world. People didn't write that way. It's obviously because of its divine inspiration. Let me mention a couple things about Moses. Moses would have been given the best education available in his day, all right? As a son of Pharaoh, or as a relative of Pharaoh, raised in Pharaoh's house, he would have had a tremendous education. And I think it's worth pointing out that God is not indifferent to education. I think for a long time I thought he was. Don't think he's indifferent to it. Think about, you have Moses, you can think of some other highly educated men in the scriptures. Think about Paul. He's not indifferent to education, but education must be broken, right? I think Moses is called because of where he is, called because of where God allowed him to be in Pharaoh's house. He is given the best equipment Egypt had to give, but then it has to be purified. Then it has to be broken by God in the wilderness, and I think that happens a lot. And again, I think Paul's a great example. It's clear that Paul was one of the most brilliant men around. But he too had to be humbled and broken. The other thing, I won't mention this a lot. Did we mention a couple weeks ago when the burning bush and God giving his name? I'm not sure if we mentioned this or not. So At the burning bush in Exodus 3:14, Moses is having his debate with God after these 40 years when he was initially wanted to be a deliverer. By the way, just a side comment, Stephen, when he preaches in Acts chapter 7, he mentions Moses, and the way he preaches Moses is Moses was their deliverer, and they didn't recognize it the first time. In other words, in one sense, Moses probably had something to learn, but in another sense, that other Israelite that was, ratting him out didn't understand. He was their deliverer. Because if you look at the way Stephen preaches it, he preaches, look at all the leaders that God sent to his people that they rejected. And you finally rejected the most important one. Does that make sense? He was destined and called to be their leader, but again, he had to be prepared. All right, Exodus 3:14. So, I am. God, he gives his name. I think I did mention this last week, that this was his personal name. But there is also something about his name where he says, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And it's important to note that when God says, I will be who I will be, pay attention to who he is in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Does that make sense? I will be who I will be. Pay attention and you'll find out. All right? There's a sense in which God is calling Moses and Israel to say, well, I'm sufficient. I've called your relationship with me, so walk with me and find out who I will be. All right? And I think maybe one of the most important moments, and I've referred to this several times in the class, one of the most important moments is when God cuts his covenant with his people, and while Moses is on the mountain, they build the golden calf. And in the incident after that, God says, look, Moses, let me get rid of them, and I'll start over with you. And Moses says, no, then people will know that you couldn't do this with your people. Exodus 34. This is maybe one of the most important statements of God's character in Scripture. All right, this is what I mean by, or this is what is meant by, you have to look at the context of things. So God says, pay attention to who I am. I will be who I will be. I will be what I need to be. So Israel in chapter 32 builds the golden calf. In chapter 33, God says, y'all leave. Moses intercedes. And in 33, he says, please show me your glory. And God tells him his goodness will pass before him. And then God passes before him in chapter 34, and God says, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the children's children to the third and fourth generation. It's important that God says it there, where Israel has just done what she did, just broke covenant with God right after cutting covenant with God, and God says, this is who I am. And I think it's important. I don't think God lays out very clearly the limits of his mercy. Does that make sense? He says his mercy is incredible, but he says, well, there's a limit, right? I will by no means clear the guilty. I think this is part of what's going on here. He front loads his mercy, but he says, well, there's a limit. All right, and I think that's important. And he doesn't give it, and this is how far you can go, and then that's it. Because who does that in any relationship, right? So at any rate, it's real important to understand what God says about himself by saying this when he says it there in Exodus chapter 34. Okay, there's a couple things about Exodus. So just going over, take a look at the story. You have the Exodus itself, when Israel goes out, and it takes a long time to get there before it happens. You have Leviticus, which it covers a month with God giving details about the sacrifices in particular. That's the main thing that goes on there. And then you have Numbers, which covers a long time, right? This covers 40 years, all right? Because Numbers goes through 7 failures of Israel as they are leading up to the promised land, 7 grumbling, 7 rebellions, and then God gives them their 40 years, and then wraps up with Deuteronomy, Moses saying, all right, listen, we've been out here 42 years, I can't go in because of you, and now I'm going to remind you of what God has done these 42 years and what God has said these 42 years. So there's the big picture, and we'll, in a minute or in a little bit, try to go through some of what each book covers. A few things about what we get generally. The law, the calendar, and the tabernacle. All right. Obviously, the law is maybe, well, I don't know. The law is one of the most important. And I'll elaborate on this in a minute. I've said it again and again. The law is good. Paul says the law is good. Paul, in fact, says the law is spiritual. All right? And I think there's a real tendency for us to, or I think there's an evangelical tendency to look at the law and say, oh, the law is bad and we're done with that and this is great. And it's true we're not under the law, but the law can still teach us about Christ. And that is its role. All right? It can still teach us about the character of Christ and the character of his sacrifice. It is about our behavior, and it is about Israel's behavior, and it is about the character of God. And I've continually said that the law is a sketch of God's character. All right? It is an outline. I think I used the image that Paul uses before, a shadow of an outline of Christ's character. So they get the law, they're called to be God's people, and they get a picture of his character that they're called to walk in. They get their time reset. All right, and God resets all of their time. So he gives them a new New Year's Day, which is a celebration of them being set free from slavery. He gives them new months. And all of their time is ordered by his time, right? They get the beginning of their years when they're set free. The beginning of their week is when they rest in God's reign and his rule. Then they cease from their work to tune into God. And they, throughout the year, have times when they're to stop and celebrate who God is and what he's done. So they get God speaking to their behavior, they get God speaking to their time and ordering their time, and finally God speaks to space, where they live, all right? That is ordered by his presence and his purposes and his will. Remember the theme, I keep bringing this theme back up again and again, God's people in God's presence, in God's place. All right, it's an important theme. It starts in Genesis, it ends in Revelation. We see an important stopping point for Israel here in the wilderness because they are in God's presence with the tabernacle. They are his people, and they are called to extend that place outward. As I said, Christ is all over Leviticus, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, among other things. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'll give some more details of what New Testament writers said in a minute. The tabernacle is all about approaching God. It is all about God's desire to draw Israel to himself and creation to himself. And we eventually understand that Christ is the temple. Okay, remember he says, this temple of my body, tear it down, we'll rebuild it in 3 days. He is the sacrifice of the temple. And he is the high priest. All right, he's all three. We get them broken out in Leviticus, but he's all three, and he, again, he's all over that. And so this is what I mean, we can't just do away with Leviticus, but we can go back there, and it gives us more understanding of who Christ is as high priest. And by the way, he then calls his people, think about it, we can all think of scriptures where we are called the temple of the living God, where we are called to be a living sacrifice, and where we are called a priesthood. All right, so not only does Leviticus teach us about what Christ did, but he teaches us about what we are supposed to be in learning to live, ordering our character, our time, and our space around his lordship. All right, so the Mosaic covenant is when God basically, I think it's a good way to look at it, he marries Israel. In fact, when you get to the later prophets, he says this again and again. I betrothed you, I married you, I saw you, you were like a baby thrown out, and I called you to myself. And so the Mosaic covenant is in a sense when God marries Israel. And he says, very importantly, I led you out of Egypt. I led you from slavery, therefore. And I think that therefore is very important. The Ten Commandments wouldn't have been understood then as let's earn favor from God. All right? They would have been understood in that context as, or God was trying to communicate to them, I called you to myself, I set you free from slavery in Egypt. Now, this is the natural response you should have to me. And this theme of servanthood is very repetitive. And I'll just point out, I'm not going to explore this a lot, but if you read Romans, Paul really does seem to be referring to the Exodus and the wilderness in Romans. He seems to be referring to slavery in Egypt, which is slavery to sin, and being set free from that, and now we are slaves of God. So, for example, in Romans 6, he says, we are to present our members as instruments of righteousness, where we used to present them to wickedness. Now we're to present them as instruments to righteousness. And he can even say this in Romans 6:18, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. All right? Israel was called to be delivered from their slavery in Egypt to be slaves of God, to be servants of God, to serve God in the wilderness. So it was from slavery of death to slavery that brings life. Does that make sense? And again, if you pay attention, I'll probably reference this in a minute, Paul talks about that, but then in Romans chapter 8, he talks about the sufferings of this present time. And I think there's a real parallel in that to the wilderness wanderings, right? When Israel was in the wilderness, the sufferings of this present time. And we are led by the Spirit, just as Israel was led by the cloud of pillar, or the cloud of smoke by day and fire by night. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the law and some of the things that we learned from the law in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, or Numbers. First, God is different. That's maybe the most important thing. Holiness, among other things, means difference. God is just absolutely unlike us. But God doesn't want things to remain that way. He is absolutely set apart. And so the people of God were called to be holy unto the Lord. He is different, and they were called to be set apart to be different unto Him. God's holiness means that He's absolutely different in character than we. Israel's holiness meant that they were supposed to be set apart for God. I always think of a toothbrush. Your toothbrush is holy unto you. Okay? Nobody else is to use it. Israel was to be uniquely given to God, and nobody else was to use it. It really is a good example. There's a couple things in modern life that are similar to the holiness codes. One is germs. Think about surgery and the way they are with germs, right? The other is electricity. Okay, think about how anybody here, if you ever work with electricity, or if you know anybody that works with electricity, you must be careful with electricity. It's holy. You take the wrong step and it'll kill you, right? This is in many ways how the holiness codes are treated and how God's holiness is treated. So His people are to be different. And ultimately they're to learn the spirit of the law. All right? I said a minute ago, I don't think that the law was given to be a false way to God. It was meant to draw out His character. And among other things, the negative side of the law that Paul says is that it's got a diagnostic role, right? The law was supposed to show His people His character and how they didn't measure up to His character. His character and how there was something wrong inside of them that needed to be addressed, all right? And again, if you think about, they marry God and immediately break that. They are given these sacrificial codes. Here, they continually rebel against Him. He remains faithful and gets them to the place that they need to be to go into the promised land. He is different. They are different in a bad way, and He is faithful to them to try to bring them into His holiness. The law was meant to teach God's people, teach them that God was different, and that they were to be different, like God was different. And remember, Israel's failures again and again. They wanted a king. God wanted to give them a king, but they wanted a king to be like the nations around them. All right? And the call of God's people is always to be different as God is different. When Jesus comes along, He merely pointed out that the law alone wasn't working. All right? He said, I come to fulfill the law. And very importantly, Paul says that we who live by the Spirit fulfill the law. All right? So the point of the law, among other things, was to show God's character, to teach God's people that they did not have God's character in their hearts, and that they needed God to do something to enable them to walk and live in God's character. So again, Romans, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free. Notice that language of being set free, the Exodus. Okay? It's very deliberate. Has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. As Christians are led by the Spirit, they fulfill the law. Now that does not necessarily mean they fulfill the letter of the Old Testament law, but they fulfill the spirit of it. And this is another reason we need to study these books of the Old Testament, because we can get a sense of their spirit with the Holy Spirit and understanding Christ. Does that make sense? We can come to a greater understanding of God's heart behind the law. Let's see. So as I've already mentioned, the law had parts that regulated sacred space. Let me give an example of the spirit of the law that I think we can still glean from it. So I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23. This is a law that we don't have a lot, or that isn't really relevant to most of us, but 23 and 24. If you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes. Okay, so if you go into your neighbor's vineyard, he's got a vineyard, and you're hungry, you can eat the grapes. You may eat your fill of grapes, as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in your bag. Okay? If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, this comes up with Jesus, right? If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. All right? So I think this can teach us things about God's character. Among other things, I think there's a regard for the poor, right? There's a regard for those that they could get a meal, those that didn't have much. But by the same token, they had to respect the property, the total property. You know, if I have a field of grapes, one person eating their fill is not going to wipe me out, right? So it has regard in God's character both for the private property of that person, but also for the poor or the property of others. So God cares about the poor, but he cares about work as well. You can say the same thing about gleaning laws, right? The gleaning laws were, everybody's familiar with those, right? The gleaning laws were when you harvest, don't harvest all the corners. And if you drop stuff, just leave it for the poor. And the beauty of this one to me is that the poor are regarded, but they have to work to get what they get. Does that make sense? Ruth has to go out. She gets charity. It is charity, but she has to work to get it. All right, it's not just handed to her. So again, I think that's a great example of how in various parts of the law we see God's character. We see how that can apply today. All right, a few comments about the Ten Commandments themselves. Many people say that the Ten Commandments themselves are the whole law in a nutshell. That much of the Pentateuch, which by the way, I don't know if we've used that expression. And actually, am I spelling it right? I think that's right. The Pentateuch is the 5 books of Moses. Okay? The Sadducees only respected the 5 books of Moses. They didn't respect any of the other books of the Old Testament. This is why they didn't believe in the resurrection, among other things. But many people see the Pentateuch as just an elaboration of the 10 Commandments and what they teach. Just a few comments on the 10 Commandments. Actually, not all the 10 Commandments, just a few of them. Idols in the ancient world. I think we mentioned this before. Idols were seen as a way to meet the needs of the god so that the god could help you out. All right? Gods were provided with food. Gods were provided with shelter. God says, you shall make no graven image of me. I don't have any needs that you need to meet. All right? In part, it's about changing their understanding of worship. All these nations around you, the Egyptians, this is how they worship their gods. I don't have needs that you need to meet. The cattle on 1,000 hills are mine, God will say later. Idols also represented limits on the God, right? They represented the limits of that God, and God says, listen, you can't limit my authority in your life or your understanding of me. The Lord's name in vain, I like this one. This is not about cursing, I don't think. Although, we could talk to that. I think this is about vain uses of God's name. Or I might even I like to call it this way, identity theft. Does that make sense? Identity theft with God would be using God's name either in a way you don't mean, right? People do that a lot, right? They might, this is, for example, don't pray when it's not your heart, it's not your intention. But it's also putting God's name to something that his name isn't on. Does that make sense? It is thinking that you can simply invoke God's name for whatever you want. I would say a New Testament corollary is you pray anything in my name. The key qualification there is in my name. On my mission, consistent with my character. Does that make sense? And the prohibition against don't take up my name in vain is don't take it up lightly, don't take it up flippantly, and certainly don't take it up for a cause that is not mine. Let's see. Honor your father and mother. Among other things, honor your father and mother touches on honor those who have passed the covenant onto you. All right, remember we touched on one of the most important things in the Bible is the next generation, is be fruitful and multiply. Is Abraham, you're going to have a kid, and hey, Genesis chapter 18, let's talk to Moses about this because he's going to teach his kids after him. So honor your father and mother, and it has to do with a lot of things. They're the image of God in your life, but it also has to do with they're the ones who passed on the covenant with God to you. They're the ones who called you to the calling you have by bringing you into existence. All right. I'll talk about the tabernacle briefly. So we talked about the law and God's character. Now God gives the tabernacle, and in Hebrews it tells us that the tabernacle was an image of this pattern that Moses saw, this perfect heavenly pattern that he says Jesus brought his blood into. I want to say a few things about the tabernacle. One is that it's the first time since Eden that God has been with Adam, in Adam's presence again, mankind, all right? I don't know if I mentioned this early on, but the tabernacle is a garden, all right? It has all the hallmarks of the garden. It has palm trees and pomegranate trees. Remember, it's decorated with these. It has cherubim, which were in the garden, right? A signal, a sign of God's presence. And so for the first time since Eden, when mankind was exiled from the garden, mankind, or God's people, are back with him in his presence. All right? But there's a fulfillment of his promise and there's a deferment of his promise. And by the way, that's a theme I think we've mentioned that'll come up again and again. I can't spell.
I wouldn't know.
All right, well, there you go. Fulfillment and deferment. People are in God's presence again, but there's problems with it. People are in God's presence again, but it seems like there's more to be accomplished. All right? God dwells with his people in the tabernacle, but there's still a separation. All right? There's still the sacrificial system that separates them. And Jesus came to fully deal with that, right? To fully deal with the separation that is there. So blood and anxiety mark the temple, right? Blood, again, we were talking in the beginning, the amount of blood in Jesus' day that would have been shed at a typical festival of the Jews, and the number of Jews that were coming to Jerusalem to worship is staggering, all right? I mean, the priests, you have to remember, were essentially butchers, okay? They would have known butchering animals and known the animals better than anybody, and they would have seen a lot of blood. So the temple is fraught now with anxiety. And think about all those episodes where the strange fire is offered. Boom, Aaron's sons are killed, and Aaron's not allowed to mourn. Think about later with David, Uzzah. David's a guy who pleases God, but they did not understand what it means to dwell in God's presence. And so Uzzah suffers. David says, right, I can't have the